Welcome to our second webinar on Teaching with Technology. Tonight we're going to be talking about innovative ways to use technology to assess deep learning. My name is Caroline Manny. I'm an instructional technologist here at Midway University. I also have a PhD in Spanish and a master's degree in information science and in computer forensics. So I've taught quite a bit. I know a little bit about assessment, enough to know that at this time of year, I'm probably looking to get burned in effigy by talking about assessment, since everybody is deep in grading and looking forward to getting their papers and even more grading and final exams and so forth. But here we go. We're going to go ahead and talk about assessment. What is assessment? When you think of assessment, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Most people probably say quizzes and exams, definitely, and most would add papers and projects, whether they be individual projects or group projects, after a moment's more thought. And that is certainly the most traditional ways to think about assessment. But as we go into this webinar, if you're an online teacher, I'd like you to consider this. Traditional testing may be problematic online, given the potential for students to use materials such as books, dictionaries, the internet, and help of friends, and probably 100 other things that I've never thought of, that you as the instructor doesn't really intend for them to use. And if you are a face-to-face teacher, consider this. Quizzes and tests alone are not multiple and diverse assessments. They're only one way that we can use to assess people's knowledge. And even the best designed quiz or test does not truly test all or even most of the components of deep learning. We'll define that term here in a minute. And finally, quizzes and tests do not allow all students to show their best work. We've all heard people say, "I'm just not a good test taker." Well, in some cases, that's really true. So, as we go through this webinar, my challenge to you is to think about how you can diversify the assessment methods that you use to encourage deep learning in your classes. Quizzes and exams are great things. We can't get away from them. There's no doubt about it. And in some divisions, I suppose we could say, exams and quizzes are kind of the primary way that we assess our students. And that's the traditional way and the long-standing way. But we're going to be looking at a variety of different ways, and hopefully you can get some ideas about how you can add different types of assessments into your classes. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll start out with the question again, what is assessment? Assessment is the process of gathering and discussing information from multiple and diverse sources in order to develop a deep understanding of what students know, understand, and can do with their knowledge as a result of their educational experiences. The process culminates when assessment results are used to improve subsequent learning. There's three things that I want to emphasize in this definition. The first one is multiple and diverse sources. Again, emphasizing that while tests and exams and quizzes are important, we need to use different methods of assessment, more methods than just tests and quizzes. The second part of the definition that I want to emphasize is what students know, understand, and can do with their knowledge. We're supposed to be testing what they know, that's obvious, what they understand, that's obvious, but what they can do with their knowledge. What they know, understand, and can do with their knowledge should sound like a really familiar term to you, because it's the basic definition of a student learning outcome, right? When we define the student learning outcomes for our course, we're defining what we want students to know, understand, and do by the time they're finished with it. So our assessments need to get at the can-do part of the student learning outcome also. Not just what they've memorized, but how they can apply their knowledge. And the final part of the definition that I want to emphasize is the process culminates when assessment results are used to improve subsequent learning. In other words, closing the assessment loop. And we'll talk about that more at the end of the webinar, so just kind of keep that in mind. But for now, let's move on. How do we create assessments that are aligned with our student learning outcomes? How do we create assessments that test what students know, understand, and can do? we turn to our favorite, Bloom's taxonomy. Just as a reminder, here is Bloom's taxonomy. We have the pyramid of cognitive processes. At its base, students need to be able to remember facts. For example, I am, as I said, a Spanish teacher. If my student learning outcome is for my students to be able to have a dialogue with me by the end of the class, and that is my student learning outcome, they can't have a dialogue with me if they don't know any words in Spanish. So they are going to have to memorize some vocabulary. They can't have a dialogue with me unless they know some grammar rules. So they are going to have to memorize some grammar rules. Memorization is at the base of the pyramid here. We can't move forward until we remember things. Now, the next step up the pyramid is understanding. Obviously, a student in my Spanish class, again, could recite the grammar rule. The preterite tense is used for completed past actions, and the imperfect tense is used for repeated or continuous actions in the past. They could recite that all day long without the slightest clue what it means, and it isn't going to do them any good. So in addition to memorizing and being able to regurgitate information and rules and so forth, they need to actually be able to understand what those rules mean. They need to be able to maybe explain it in their own words and give real examples of it before we can move on. Now, once students remember and understand what we're talking about, then we can move up the pyramid. Students can apply what they've learned. They can analyze what they've learned. They can evaluate what they've learned. And finally, at the very top of the pyramid, they can create with what they've learned. So we want to move students from remembering and understanding up to actually being able to create with their knowledge. Let's look at an example of that. Maybe one that won't give you flashbacks to your high school Spanish grammar lessons, drill and kill. Let's pretend that I am a nursing professor here at Midway. If I was, maybe one of my student learning outcomes would be, for one of my courses, would be students will apply their understanding of the anatomy of the shoulder to develop treatment plans for patients. That would be a perfectly reasonable student learning outcome for a nursing class. Before students could develop any sort of treatment plan for shoulders, they're going to have to be able to, for example, remember and name the muscles of the rotator cuff. And they're going to have to understand, how does the rotator cuff help a person raise their arm? That's the basics. And those are the types of questions that you would ask in an assessment to test those basics. After that, then they can move on. They can apply that knowledge. So maybe my question would be, for applying knowledge, would be, why does throwing a curveball cause rotator cuff injury? That would be an application type assessment question. For analyze, maybe the assessment question would be, how does the throwing motion stress each component in turn of the rotator cuff? For the evaluate, cognitive process, maybe the assessment question would be for the student to evaluate another physical therapist program to strengthen the rotator cuff. And then finally, once they can do all of that, then they're at the point where, for the create cognitive process, they can design their own physical therapy program to strengthen the components of the rotator cuff. Okay, so you can see these are the types of questions, assessment questions or activities that go along with the different levels of the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid. For remember and understand, these are probably simple multiple choice or matching type questions, right? But for apply, analyze, evaluate, and create, these are, at the very least, short essay questions. And certainly by the time you get down to create, this is a paper. You know, this is really advanced work. Which leads us to this sort of a chart, and finally our definition of deep learning. We have on the top the 6 cognitive processes of Bloom's revised taxonomy. Remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And then the knowledge domains, factual knowledge and conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge and metacognitive knowledge. When we're here in this yellow area, this is surface knowledge. This is the basics. We want to be moving our students here to this blue area, to deep learning, where they apply and analyze and evaluate and create with the knowledge that we're giving them. So, does anybody have, let's go ahead and pause there. Does anybody have any questions just on the concepts of how we're going to be looking at assessment items with regards to being able to test through the full range of Bloom's revised taxonomy? Okay, let's go ahead and look at some concrete examples then. We're going to go ahead and start with the remember cognitive process, where the students have to memorize their vocabulary or memorize the muscles in the rotator cuff. This particular cognitive process is perfect for quizzes and tests, such as fill-in-the-blank quizzes, matching quizzes, labeling, multiple choice, or perhaps when students are just at the reading part in an online course or the lecture part of a face-to-face class, polls, surveys, and questionnaires and things like that. Generally speaking, these are probably formative assessments. A formative assessment occurs during a learning experience. It's a low-stakes thing. It's a quick 10-point quiz. It's a quick little poll, maybe just worth 1 or 2 points. It's some quick questions that you have to answer at the end of a reading or at the end of a video in an online class, maybe worth 10 points. Real low stakes. And it's these formative assessments that allow us to figure out whether students are getting it and whether we can move on. As I said, it's a great idea to intersperse these little quizzes or activities throughout your lesson. Online, you can put them at the end of readings or videos through the questionnaire or choice or survey activities in Moodle. And face-to-face, you can break up your lecture with polls and surveys using your smartboard, Smart Labs on your smartboard, or using Socrative. I'm going to go ahead, even though this webinar is mostly aimed towards online teaching, I'm going to go ahead and show Socrative anyway because it's a really great tool that I'd like people to be aware of. Here is a picture of what you would see if you logged in as the instructor at www.socrative.com. To log in there, if you went to Socrative.com as an instructor, you would need to go ahead and create a free account. And when you log in, this is what you would see, and you would be able to show your students a quiz, or do a space race, or do an exit ticket, or just show them quick questions. What do the students see? The students don't need any sort of login for Socrative at all. They just go to www.socrative.com and you give them this room number. That's at the top of your instructor view. Anytime, any page that you're on, logged in as an instructor, you'll see that. And so the students put in that room name right there, and then they see the tests that you want them to take. And they can choose their answer and submit it, and they get immediate feedback. And you can see how they answered. And students can do this on their computers or on a phone or whatever. And in addition to you being able to see how they answered, you can download their answers in an Excel spreadsheet so that you can keep a record of how well they did or how well they didn't do. So I think that these are great little activities that you can use to break up your lecture in a face-to-face class, lecture for 5 or 10 minutes, do a quick little one question, true or false quiz, just to make sure that people are awake and active and paying attention. So I just wanted to show that tool that's great for face-to-face classes. Let's go ahead and move on up the pyramid to the understand cognitive process. For understanding, to show understanding, students might summarize lectures, readings, or videos, compare and contrast two or more theories or events or processes or readings or videos. They might classify or categorize elements of their learning. They might paraphrase documents or speeches, and they might find and identify examples or illustrations of a concept. So, for example, I might have my students keep a reflective journal where they summarize the lesson, the readings for the lesson, or the video for the lesson, and post their summaries. If they have read two things, maybe my question for them would be, instead of just summarizing, to compare and contrast them. A really great tool that you can use to have your students do these summaries. Obviously, they can turn them in as just a paper, or in Moodle, they could turn them in the forum or something like that. But if you're getting them as papers or getting them in a forum, maybe that starts to get a little bit cluttered. So you'd like to keep them in a place where they can be more organized. The Moodle Wiki is a possible tool for that. A blog is a possible tool for that. But I'd also like to show you another online tool called Storify. This is an example of Storify. You can find Storify at storify.com. And again, it is a service, a web tool that you would need to create a free account for. And this is an example of a Storify that my ICT IS 200 students did for a class that I'm teaching at UK. In this instance, I had asked my students to find readings online that were relevant to what we were talking about in class and keep an annotated bibliography of them. Again, they could have done that just typing them up in a paper or typing them up in the forum on our class Moodle site, but I preferred for them to keep their information this way. So each student created a Storify with our class name and some sort of description. And then for our information literacy discussion, for example, they could find their links. This is an actual link to a website. And then they wrote a little annotated summary of what they read. And they had to put up at least 3 per topic. How does that work? Over here, they would click on this button right here and enter the URL to the web source that they had read, and then it pops up down here and they can drag it over to their work area. This is their work area. And once they have it there, they can click down below it or above it or anywhere, and it gives them a place to type. And what I really like about this is by the time they're done, they have a whole body of knowledge that they can look at and study, and it represents everything that we've learned in class and their work. So that's the first thing that I like. It really gives them a big overall picture of what they've learned. And the other thing that I like about it is it encourages them to do their own web research. So it's a really good way to have your students build information literacy. So Storify is a neat way to have your students keep a reflective journal or any type of annotated bibliography. Another way that you can test understanding that might be a little more creative than just writing summaries would be to have students take the information that you've taught in your class and have them make an infographic out of it. By having them make an infographic, they have to do really a whole lot more than just regurgitate what they've learned. They have to be able to break that information down into its important parts and be able to visualize that information, to think of ways to graphically represent it. Let me show you an example of a way that they could make infographics. Piktochart, which you can find at piktochart.com, is a great online tool for making infographics. Again, you need a free account, but once you create a free account, you can log in and you can create new infographics using one of these templates. They're free. Or you can just use a blank canvas and bring your own pictures in. The Piktochart supplies some graphics, or you can upload your own. It supplies great fonts and neat little different shapes of text boxes. And here are some examples of some infographics that some students in my ICT class made when we were talking about using social media as a marketing strategy and when we were talking about different types of communication. These are the products that the students created for me in order to summarize what they learned during those parts of the class. I really like these infographics because studies show that when students can visualize things, they retain them more. So I think infographics are a really great way to build visuals into your class. A really great assessment method. Okay, now that we've got students having memorized the material and understood it, now we can move up the pyramid to that those deeper learning cognitive processes that we're really interested in. Like, for example, the ability to apply what they've learned. Applying what they've learned in some classes, like a science class or a math class, that's really obvious, right? Because the students can do labs or simulations to show that they can apply what they've learned. We're now probably moving into summative assessments. Summative assessments are the type of assessments that are higher stakes, that you do towards the end of a learning activity, of a learning unit. As I said, for hands-on classes, the labs that they do are pretty obvious ways to test, to assess the apply cognitive process. But I'd like to suggest adding a little twist to that. A really great idea, in addition to just having the students do the lab and do a write-up of the lab, a good idea is to also have them create a how-to document that explains the process that they used to work their way through the lab, in addition to a narrative explaining when that procedure that they've summarized would be useful in the real world. So, for example, when I teach computer science, not information science, but computer science, one of the things that I teach the students is to program a router. So they learn a bunch of commands to program a router, and then they've memorized those, they understand them, and then I sit them down in front of a router and I say, okay, put those commands on this router and see if your router can communicate with your computer. After they've done that, I have them write down exactly the steps that they took to be successful and a little quick paragraph about why they would do that in the real world. There's two benefits to that. It is a valued skill in the workplace that students be able to write documentations, procedural documentation. So that writing practice is great workplace practice. And also having them talk about how this would be used in the real world makes it more valuable to them. It helps them see the value in it. Now, even in non-traditionally lab classes, you can try to imagine ways to simulate career activities that will allow the students to apply what they've learned. I'm going to show you as an example of that an activity that one of our professors here at Midway has done for his criminal justice class. He teaches crime scene investigation, and normally when he is in class, he would set up a sort of crime scene, maybe with the chalk drawing on the ground of where the body was, and a knife or whatever evidence the students would need to collect. And the students actually go through the process that they've learned of the proper way to retrieve evidence from a crime scene. Now imagine him having to teach that online. How do you set up a crime scene for your online students? He had to try to get creative in the way that he could do that. So in his Moodle course, he put up a picture of a crime scene. Probably a much scarier picture than anything he would have been able to create in his classroom. I'm pretty sure that the chair of his department would be pretty mad at him if his classroom looked like that at the end of the night. So he put up this picture. Normally in class, the students would have to wander around this room and find the evidence. Well, that room doesn't physically exist, so how can he simulate that? He put together the same picture again with QR codes. And the students can look at their QR codes with a QR code reader on their phones and see what they would have seen if they were able to walk around the room in a classroom. For example, if they looked at the QR code of what was sitting on this burnt out fireplace, they would see that a piece of possible evidence there was a backup battery. So they have to look at all these close-up pictures and determine what amongst the items in the crime scene actually had evidentiary value, and they had to collect those, write a report about how they collected those things, and would then turn them in. So that is a really creative way to use QR codes to simulate a lab activity. I thought that was a really cool idea. Now, not all apply activities have to be summative assessments. Some can still be formative assessments, like, for example, application cards. With an application card, what a student does, if you're in an in-face class, you can actually pass out index cards or have students write down something on a half piece of paper or whatever. Or if you're online, you can do this in a forum or on Padlet, which I'm about to show you. And what the students do is, after you've discussed a topic in class, the students write down at least one possible real-world application for the principle or theory or procedure or whatever it is that they've just learned. So let's look at how that might work in a program online called Padlet. You can find Padlet at padlet.com. Let me just click through to that. This is an example of a Padlet. In this instance, this was again for my ICT-IS 200 class, and we had just discussed persuasive writing and persuasive speaking in class, or at least that's what we were about to discuss. And I put this Padlet up and made it available to my students, and my question to them was, when would you use persuasion in your future profession? And so they had to reply with what their profession was going to be and when they would use persuasion. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how Padlet works. As an instructor, I have a login to Padlet, and I create this little blank canvas right here without any of these Post-it notes on it. And I make it available to my students by telling them the URL where it is. They don't need a login at all. When they log in, they just see the blank canvas. And they click right down here on this little plus, and they can add a little Post-it note. I can drag those around and organize them. The student can edit their own, but they can't fool around with anybody else's. And so, as an in-seat teacher, I put this board up at the blank at the beginning of my class. I asked my questions, and I told my students to go on their phone or on their computer to the URL that I gave them, and these little answers started popping up like mad. There's no limit to the number of people who can post to a Padlet. And I can create, with my login, as many Padlets as I want. So I can have one for this question, one for another question, and different links to those. Again, I really like these because they're a great, in this case, I use them then as a jumping off point for further discussion in my class. They're a really great way to give students a place where they can collaborate and share their ideas. I asked my students to include their names, but you can tell the students that they don't have to include their names. So this might give them a kind of anonymous place where they can post things if maybe they're too shy to participate on their own. And this is a really great way to save their work. And since I can drag these around and organize and categorize them, maybe I can use this for future work. So Padlets is a really neat little tool. Okay, let's go ahead and move on up to the analyze cognitive process on our pyramid. Analyzing activities are taking apart activities. They're activities where the students look at something and like case studies or critiques or completed labs, papers, projects, and they examine them and they break the information down into parts by selecting relevant and irrelevant parts, by determining how parts fit together, by noting bias or values or underlying intent in materials, things like that. What are some good ideas for analyze activities, analyze assessments? One great idea is case studies. Let me give you an example of a case study that I did. In one of my classes, we were talking about critical thinking versus creative thinking. And the case study that the students were required to do after we had thoroughly discussed that topic was to pick themselves plus 3 other people who were important in their future profession, and they had to categorize those people as either critical thinkers or creative thinkers. And then using what we learned about the characteristics of creative and critical thinking, they had to justify their conclusion. So they had to see how all those elements of critical and creative thinking fit together. That's a nice case study. There's also deconstruction papers. What's a deconstruction paper? In a deconstruction paper, a student would take either a research paper in their field, or perhaps it can be a more informal writing about the topic that you're talking about, and they deconstruct it. In other words, they analyze it for bias in the literature review or the methodology of the experimentation or in the results of the experimentation. This is a really beneficial activity because it exposes students to important research in their field and the way that it's written. It makes them close readers. And it requires them to practice critical thinking skills and analysis, and writing, obviously, because they have to write up their results. So it is a really great type of analysis activity. Obviously, longer and formal research papers work here too as summative assessments. But I think it's a really valuable strategy to use things like case studies and deconstruction papers and the annotated bibliographies that I mentioned earlier as building blocks along the way to a research paper. Because if you have the students do an annotated bibliography to summarize the information that they're going to be worked with, and then after they've chosen the articles that are particularly valuable to their research, if you have them deconstruct those articles to have them closely look at the way that research in their field is written and look for the bias in the methodology or results or literature review, then that really forces them to think about how their own paper can be written, and really forces them to read carefully the material that they've chosen to include in their research. And I think that way you get better formal research papers. A final way that's perhaps less of a formal way to test or assess the analyze cognitive process is to have students collaborate on concept maps. And my favorite tool for collaborating on concept maps is Coggle-It. Let me show you an example of what that looks like. This is a concept map that my students made after we finished our unit on information technology, ethics, and legal issues. I started them out with this right here, nothing more. And we had already talked about this topic as a whole. And as a final activity for it, they collaborated on this website, Coggle-It, and created categories. We talked about big data, we talked about devices, we talked about the cloud, and we talked about social media. And then all the ways that we branched off from those larger categories. And this was something, this is a pretty neat summary of our class discussions, but it literally took my class, I had them do this in class. This is something that you can have your online students do and collaborate on. It literally took them in class less than 15 minutes to do this. It's really simple. When you're online, when you click right here, one of these little lines just spurts out. And if you click again, another little line spurts out. If you want to click right here, then these spurt out. And then you get a text box, and you can add your text, and you can add your pictures, and you can even add links to web resources and stuff like that. I really like these as a way for students to show that they can kind of see the big picture and break it all down and analyze it and put it back together. And what I have my students do with these once they're done, I put them in our course wiki at the top of the kind of overall topic so that they can see where everything, you see all the aspects of the topic and see what all they need to be sure to review. It's a really neat tool. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the evaluate cognitive process. For evaluate, now we're putting stuff back together. We're creating activities such as journals, diaries, critiques, problem sets, product reviews, and studies that require the students to put information back together. What are some good activities for that? Debates work really well for that. Juries, where students critique each other's work. And 4S activities. 4S activities present the student with a significant problem based on something that you've been talking about. So for my ethics and legal issues in computer privacy, one of the things that we talked about was, for example, problems that are created with the cloud, privacy and security problems in the cloud. So maybe I might propose something related to that to them as a problem that they need to then solve. The 4S's come from the fact that that is a significant problem. All students get the same problem. The groups, when they work together, or the individuals, if they're working alone, have to make a specific decision. They have to say, the way I'm going to solve this problem is this way, and here's why, and here's how. Here are all my steps of the solution. And then the last S is simultaneous reporting. So everybody sees everybody else's solution at the same time. Nobody sees somebody's beforehand. So you don't get people kind of copying off each other, get that answer drift, right? And then once everybody has solved their problem and it's posted it, we can either have a forum discussion or an in-class discussion about how to compare the different solutions and why people came to different resolutions of the problem and which ones, what are the advantages of some, what are the disadvantages of some, and so forth. Obviously, the chat in Moodle would be a good place to do that. Forums would be a good place to do that. You could store your answers in the wiki in Moodle or in a blog, those sorts of things. So those are some great ideas for evaluating, for the evaluate cognitive process. Another type of activity that goes with this are observations and site visits. Like, for example, for teaching students, teaching students, people who are learning to be teachers, often go and observe teachers. I'm sure that happens in the medical profession. It definitely happened in library science. There's probably lots of opportunities for people to go to observe people doing their jobs or observe objects related to a class. Like, for example, if a student is in a civic engineering class, maybe they go and observe an example of civic engineering, like a bridge or a street or something like that. And then we need for them to evaluate it and return their results. They can do that in the form of a presentation, and they can certainly do it in the form of a video presentation for an online class. But another really neat way to do video presentations, really short, concise, to the point ones, is using a tool called Photobabble. Let's have a look at Photobabble. And to do this, I actually have to break out and go to this. There was no way I could embed a screenshot. So I'm just going to break out of the PowerPoint presentation and take you over to Photobabble. This is www.photobabble.com, and the way Photobabble works is the student who has gone to a site visit has maybe taken a picture of something they found interesting at that site visit. Like, for example, in this case, the students were required to go and look at collaborative spaces and evaluate them, evaluate their pros and cons. And so this student went to the second floor of the library at University of Kentucky and looked at these whiteboard spaces, and they took a picture. Then you can upload that picture in Photobabble. You can choose a picture and click Create. I'll just do a different picture here. And once your picture's in there, then you can just click on the Record button and record what it is that you want to talk about. And then you can share that recording in a link. So that is a great way for students to report back on their site visits or observations of whatever they were supposed to observe, and create a quick little video presentation that could be stored in the wiki on Moodle or in a blog, so that all of the students could look at the other students' work. Okay, and we have finally reached the Create domain. For Create, students are going to do activities such as formal research projects, musical compositions, performances, essays, business plans, website designs, set designs for theater classes, things like that. Anything that makes the student make, build, or design or generate something new with the knowledge that they've learned. Obviously, performances can be any type of presentation that they do. And as I mentioned, we can definitely use videos in an online class to have students give their presentations in a way that all of students can, in the way that all other students in the class can benefit from them. And then another thing that I would like to call attention to, an idea that I'd like to call attention to in this domain, is the creation of class portfolios, learning portfolios. I really like class portfolios when They're not just a compilation of all the stuff that the students have done in the semester just kind of thrown together, but rather they are collections of the students' best work, and they contain reflections and commentaries by the student on why this was an important exercise. What did we learn? What did I learn when I did this exercise? And what were the challenges? How did I overcome them? What's the overall connection of this activity to the class? I think portfolios are a really great way for students to see their progress from the beginning of the course to the end of the course. Really be aware of their own progress, some metacognition of what they have learned. For online courses, those portfolios can be done in the wiki or in a blog or possibly on Storify that we talked about earlier. And I know this slide is crazy, but since I am extolling the virtues of portfolios, I think it is important to talk about 5 of their virtues and some of their warnings. Like I said, portfolios are not just collections of stuff that people throw together. There actually needs to be reflection. Portfolios need to show some connection between the process that the learning process and the product. They need to show how the student has grown. And the responsibility for portfolios needs to be on the learner. They need to decide what is valuable enough to include in their portfolio. Beware of slick and glossy portfolios that look good but don't contain any real reflection. And when you're having students create these, beware of the amount of work that they're going to be for you, which is why I say it shouldn't be everything. It should just be maybe 3 or 4 pieces of their best work. Okay, so I've asked you to do a lot here, right? I've asked you to include a lot of activities that include a lot of writing for the students, a lot of research for the students, a lot of reading for you, and a lot of grading for you. So why is this important? These are some Pew surveys. The first one here is a survey of faculty saying what faculty thinks people need to be able to do to be successful in the workplace. Like, for example, being information literate, judging the quality of information, writing effectively, communicating ideas in creative and engaging ways, finding information quickly. This is what teachers think. This is what the public in general thinks is going to be important job skills: communication, writing, teamwork. This is what employers are looking for, and we all want our students to be successful and get jobs. Employers say that they're looking for critical thinking and analytical reasoning, problem solving, written and oral communication, information literacy, innovation and creativity, teamwork skills, quantitative reasoning. And in this same survey, 93% of employers said that a digital portfolio would put applicants ahead in the hiring process. So this is why I really think that adding activities above and beyond the easy to grade objective test, multiple choice tests, true false tests, short answer tests, these are easy things that Moodle can grade for you. And I obviously in December, as I'm facing a stack of papers, I see the value of those. But because employers and the public in general put so much emphasis on the importance of developing writing skills, developing critical thinking skills, developing creativity and problem solving and analytical skills, that's why we need to be testing these things as well. What are instructors assigning according to that same Pew study? Short essays, a good amount, but research papers, not nearly as much. So I'd like to encourage people to do that more. That said, as we face those stacks of papers, how can we provide multiple formative and summative assessments without going insane from overwork? Here are some suggestions. For low stakes, low value assessments, consider just using a plus or minus or a check mark grading system. That kind of thing can be easily entered into the Moodle gradebook as direct grading, maybe just assigning 2 points for a plus or a check and no points for a minus or no check. For quick assessments, that's for low stakes things, that's an easy way to do it. For more important formative assessments and for non-test summative assessments, I recommend using rubrics or grading guides. Instructions for setting up rubrics or grading guides are available at that link under the chat and forums activities, and they really make grading easier. When you use a rubric or a grading guide, your grading is broken up into areas that you're looking for. This rubric is crazy, but I just wanted to give you a lot of different examples of different things that you might include as part of your rubric that you're going to assess: content, organization, analysis, writing conventions, word choice and voice is appropriate for the discipline, your formatting, documentation, critical thinking, so forth. These are all the types of things that you can include in a rubric. And in Moodle, you can assign point values, as wide a range as you want. In this particular rubric, we've just used unacceptable to be a 0, a 1 to be barely adequate, a 2 to be good but not exemplary, and then a 3. So we've only got a range of 4 points that we can give. And when you're grading this in Moodle, you can literally just score 0 through 3 in each one of these areas, and then it enters the grade for you. You're done. So it's a really quick way to read, scan for these things that you said you were going to be looking for, and move on. Finally, just to conclude, I promised at the end that or at the beginning, that at the end we would talk about the assessment cycle and closing the assessment loop. So I would be remiss if I didn't do that. When we assess, when we test students, however we choose to do it, one of the goals of that assessment needs to be, at the end of the course, to reflect upon how the course went, how the activities went, how the assessments proved that the students learned or didn't learn, and then make changes in the course for future times that we teach it in order to improve how the next learners will do. That is the improving part of the assessment cycle. That's how we close the assessment loop. Okay, and that is the end of our webinar. Are there any questions? I don't see any. Let me just check in this other location. Nope, I don't see any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up.